Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for, thanks for coming. Thanks for finding this room. I got lost too. Let's crack on. I know this has an incredibly long title, but today I'm going to talk about security advocacy and how we shouldn't just be doing it for security professionals. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that I've done in my spare time. Quickly, before we go any further, I'll just introduce myself. My name's Sarah Young. I am a cloud security advocate at Microsoft. I live in Melbourne. I've been really lucky. I've lived in a couple of different places now. I say that I've worked in security since before it became cool. We know security is cool now. And I have created a lot of content over the years. I'm also a prolific meme user. I have tried to tone down the number of memes in this presentation, but there's still a few, so hopefully you like them. Sorry if it's not your thing. I'm also a dog mom ×2. These are my dogs. They are obviously not with me today because they couldn't bring them from Australia, but I did dress them up in black hat gear. You can buy this in Black Hat USA. I don't think you can get it in Asia, but you know, I have black hat dogs. So also, I've created a lot of content. It's now my job in Microsoft to actually do content creation, but I've done it before that. I have, for my sins, I've written a couple of Microsoft exam books, and I do a podcast about Microsoft stuff as well. That's not really a plug for those things. It's just more of I create content. So it's something that I do as my day-to-day job. So what I'm going to talk about today is just a bit of talk about how content creation got started. We'll talk a bit of level set about what content creation is, who content creators are, and just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to talk a little bit about content creation principles because, you know, I'm going to assume that, like me, most of the people here in the room are not, haven't come from a communications, content creation, marketing background, and so it's something that I had to go and look at and teach myself, and it's pretty confusing. I'll then talk to you about the research that I did, which took me the last few months, and then just how we're going to fix the problem that I've seen, and we'll also talk a little bit about the challenges of scale. But to start with, security people started creating things, and I very specifically use the word things because we create lots of different things. As technology has expanded, particularly as the internet has become a thing, that has also, it's become much more accessible. It's really easy for someone to write a blog post, create a podcast. I can tell you that for sure. You just buy a mic, all kinds of different things. And it was interesting, the stuff we made, but we only make it. Think about anything you've ever written, you've ever read, or any kind of thing you've made. We write for other security people. We do. I am also guilty of this. But unlike other bits of technical content that we have, security affects everybody. If you were writing something about Java, if you were writing something about .NET, that is very specific. If you're not writing in Java, if you're not writing in .NET, it's probably not a big deal. Security is unique though, because security affects everybody. If you connect something to the internet, you've got a security concern. So that's not just security professionals, it's also other IT professionals, and it's your everyday people. So we have a unique challenge with security content that it actually affects everybody. And so we need to be really mindful of how we create this sort of stuff. And we just don't do that. We don't create it for everybody. Here you go, first meme of the day. This is security folks reviewing each other's content. You know, I am guilty of this. If you create something, do you send it to your security teammate friend to review? Of course you do. And they think it's great, but we're not asking the wider world, is this understandable? Is it useful? So just a quick level set on what I mean by content before we go any further. You know, what is content? I'm talking about documents, I'm talking about training materials or training courses. I'm talking about videos, blog posts, podcasts. In other words, any consumable media you can think of, whether you're reading, writing, listening, that's what I'm talking about when I say content. So it's a very wide range of things. And as I was saying before, the barrier to creating this has become much lower just with the explosion of online platforms, which is a great thing, but it also means we're getting a lot of content that's completely unvetted or unreviewed, and so it can be of questionable quality sometimes. And when I say content creator as well, what do we think of? you may think of like a YouTube influencer, PewDiePie or something like that. And we do have technical content creators out there too. But in fact, content creators can be anybody who makes the things I was talking about. So there's obviously people like me, devrel or advocate people whose job it is to create content. But we have those content creators that I don't know what else to call them. I want to differentiate between a content creator, say like an influencer like a PewDiePie who's streaming games, and our technical content creators. That, you know, there are people in our industry who just write content. That's their job. Engineers write content as well. Technical writers, of course, we employ those too. And essentially, it can be anybody. And I'm pretty sure everybody in this room will have created some kind of content, even if you haven't sort of consciously thought that's what it was. And as you say, we're all content creators, all of us. So there you go. But I wanted to talk about content creation principles as well. They're confusing, basically. I'm going to put now 2 sets of what I think are very contradictory content creation principles. So for a start, your content should position you as an industry thought leader. Great. You sound good. And that's particularly a vendor thing, right? So, you know, vendors, we want to sound like we're thought leaders because we sound smart, and then you want to buy our product, you know. So that's why we create very long documents that sound good with lots of long words, because aren't we smart? And creating content for everybody is creating content for no one. So what does that mean? I mean, basically what we're saying there is, you know, you need to have a specific audience in mind. Now, that's one set of principles. Secondly, good content is concise, and good content is meaningful and accessible. Now, I would argue that those second two are the complete opposite of the first two, because, yeah, who's read thought leadership here? Hands up. Who's read something that says it's thought leadership, or listened to something? Would you call thought leadership stuff generally concise? No. And would you call it meaningful and accessible, or is it more of a, I sound clever? Yeah, you don't have to answer that. But look, it's like more memes of the day. I think that we like to do this, okay? But these principles are actually contradictory, okay? And that's a problem. It really is. So the last thing I'll talk about, this is not a security or tech industry specific problem. It's known as the expert problem. So the expert problem is kind of a well-known thing in human psychology, that the more you know about a topic, whatever it is, the worse you are at explaining it to other people who do not understand what you're talking about. Because you start to assume knowledge. You start to assume that people have a base level of knowledge that they do not. And so when you're trying to explain something to someone who doesn't understand it, it can be difficult because you assume things. So that's a problem as well. Secondly, there's another problem we have here about deferring to experts. And again, it's not a technology-specific problem. It's a wider human issue that we often copy what has gone before. So if you've seen some thought leadership or something like that, or a way of writing things, if you need to write something or create something, you will copy an example of what you've seen before, because that is the correct way. I have done this. The first time I ever wrote a blog at my current employer, the first thing I did was go and read other blogs, and I wanted to copy kind of the style and the format it was in. I never thought to challenge the way it was done, and that isn't always right. Just because something's been done one way before by experts doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way. Another way of looking at this is to look at aviation. Now, I could do a whole talk on aviation and how there are so many parallels between aviation safety and security, but that's another topic for another day. But there is a concept in aviation called CRM, or crew resource management. And in short, the idea is you'll have at least 2 pilots on a plane, right? And you'll have your captain, who is the in-charge one, ultimately the top person, and you have your first officer. Now, there have been accidents, and I reference it in the appendices of these slides. There have been plane accidents where the captain has made a mistake, the more senior person. The first officer has realized, but they have not felt that they could speak up and say, hey, I think you're doing this wrong. I think you've missed something, because of cultural things and the idea that we must defer to that person who is more experienced than us, who knows what they're doing. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, it's fascinating. Do go and look it up. Like I said, it's not a security or aviation specific problem. It's just kind of how people think. And last but not least, this quote was given to me by one of my very awesome colleagues. Easy reading is damn hard writing. But often we are pushed for deadlines. We need to create something. We need to get it out the door. And we don't think about, we're just trying to get our thoughts down onto paper. So let me, because this was a bit of a lead up, because 10 minutes in and I haven't told you about the research. So what I did was I decided I wanted to really look at content. And I wanted to consume as much security content as I could reasonably as a person. So I was just using search engines to find content. Sadly, this was a hugely manual process. There is no way to automate reading and writing, reading and listening to and consuming. I did it whilst I was walking my dogs, when I was in the car, whilst I was cooking. It's completely messed up my YouTube algorithm, let me tell you. And yeah, spent a lot of time looking at all this different kind of content. And I assessed around 200 pieces of content. Now, look, I will caveat this with, clearly there is more than 200 pieces of content, security content created out there. There are hundreds and thousands, but there's only so much one lady can do at a point in time. And to find that content, these were the phrases I searched for. I'll pop them all up on the screen because that's a little bit easier. So essentially, I searched for variations of cyber security fundamentals, beginners, how-tos, etc. And the reason I did that is because, and of course I would get very different results if I'd have searched for completely different phrases, but I wanted to search for phrases that are the kind of thing that I would think people who were trying to get into security or were newer to industry might think of searching for. So this is how I found what I was looking at. And then what I did was I scored it, because me telling you whether I think security content is good or effective, that's quite subjective. So I wanted to try and make it more scientific and actually more, what's the opposite of subjective? Objective, just completely skip my mind. So here's my scoring system. Explaining concepts with no prior assumption of knowledge. Summarizing clear go-dos, taking action steps within the content. Something that can be implemented by one resource. Realistically, one person could do it. Doesn't link to lots of other pages or resources saying, in order for you to do this, now click here and go and do all of this. And probably realistically can be consumed in around under 1 hour and uses plain language, not lots of long words to do thought leadership. So this is how I scored it. So basically I scored everything out of 6. Now, I had a problem with my slides. There we go. I divided my content into a few buckets based on the kind of source that created them. So there were 3 buckets that that sort of everything broadly fell into. So not-for-profit. By not-for-profit, I just mean any organization that isn't trying to turn a profit. So that includes government agencies, charities, etc. Vendors, obviously vendors are vendors. Vendors make money. And then anything else came into other. So individual people who make their living from doing thought leadership courses, etc. So that's the 3 broad buckets I separated things into. Just because, it's the thing du jour. I did wonder, and this research was not helped by ChatGPT at all, but I did wonder if ChatGPT was able to tell me proportionally who wrote the most cybersecurity content online, just because it could look at the whole internet better than I could. As you can see, I'm not going to read this out, but it wasn't very helpful. It could not give me any proportions at all. So that was the end of my using AI for this particular bit of research, sadly. Told you, ChatGPT does not answer all the questions for you, let me tell you. So this is some of the results of my analysis. So Just looking at the content I reviewed, as you can see, the big two were videos and documentation, which probably doesn't come as a surprise. Everyone can film now and everybody can write things and publish them. Books and podcasts and training courses, a bit less. And then for the types of creators, again, this probably doesn't come as a massive surprise if you spend a lot of time looking at content. You can see that we have a good chunk of it, half of it belongs to vendors. Now, that shouldn't really be a surprise. Vendors have the most resources, they have the most time and resources and people to be able to create lots of content. And of course, creating content is good for vendors because they want you to use their products and they want you to use them and they want to show you how smart they are and why you should use their products. So I think there's no big surprises here. And then I gave them a rating. So as I said, it was out of 6. And then, so just as a reminder, the higher the score, the better the content is in terms of its accessibility. Now, a quick note on the word accessibility. I know that generally accessibility refers to whether people with any kind of impairments like visual or hearing can access and read things, listen to them, etc. I'm not meaning accessibility in those terms. I essentially couldn't think of a better word to describe what I was trying to get at here, but by accessibility I mean, is this understandable to someone who's outside security? Is it understandable to your everyday person? Could they pick it up and read it if they needed to? Or could another IT professional who might just need to do a bit of security on the side, could they read it and understand it? I did brainstorm with a number of friends, colleagues, and I went through the thesaurus several times to try and find a better word that wasn't a word that we use elsewhere, but sadly I couldn't. So I just wanted to note that's what I mean by accessibility, whether other people outside security can use it. Anyway, getting on to the results, you can see again, probably not a surprise that the not-for-profit score much higher on the accessibility. It makes sense because often governments, charities are trying to educate the masses. It's for the good of society. If people are more cyber aware, it makes sense for them. I'll call out some really interesting, I'm not gonna name and shame content creators or any particular thing, but I'll call out some really good ones. The CISA, the American Infrastructure Security Agency over in the US, they did something called the Quad Cyber Challenge last month. And it was a joint effort between Australia, India, Japan, and the US. And it just had one PDF that was like, if you want to secure anything, go and do these 10 things. And it was super straightforward, really concise, really good. There was a very bizarre example, and I won't say where it came from, that was giving cybersecurity advice specifically for women. And I read it because I was very intrigued. Not women specific, very, very strange, very, very strange. You can, like I said, I won't call out, I'm not naming and shaming, that's not the object of what we're doing here, but I saw some very interesting things. My favorite one that I saw, my other favorite one, was a training course. Now, training courses I found were really, most of them were really long, and not, the introductory stuff was really long. My favorite was I found that one introductory cybersecurity course was 18 hours long. And then it also had the introduction to the introduction, which was 2 hours long. And I was like, yeah, okay. Vendors, quite a bit. Vendors scored the worst, as you can see. Again, I personally don't think that's a surprise, being what I've read through now. Vendors are very keen to show that thought leadership to make you sound like, we know what we're talking about. You should definitely buy our product. We know what we're doing. Also, I mean, I will say I haven't done anything. I'm not a big maths head, and average is about as good as I can do. I haven't scored it with standard deviation or anything like that. So of course, I did look at more vendor content, but I'm not going to tell you what the deviation was and if there were more extremes, because it's getting into a level of maths ability I just don't have. I'm sorry. And content creators, they sort of came in the middle. I found if we take the average out of it, it was a real mixed bag. Some of these dedicated content creators, you could tell it was more, again, this is me being more subjective, a bit of more of a personal selling themselves project. And in that sense, and most of them are contractors, and that's how they sell their brand. So in that sense, they would come closer to being a vendor, whereas some content creators, probably ones that, or at least on the surface, appear to be doing it as a side hustle, would be closer to that not-for-profit piece, being more accessible. So really interesting stuff. And yeah, I have looked at a lot of stuff, let me tell you. Breaking it up through content type, though, I realize I kind of just turned around there and already talked about training courses, but I just found that one really interesting. Documentation actually comes out on top, though, but I think that's actually I think that's probably because as well, the not-for-profits that tend to make the content that's a bit more accessible, documentation's like very low barrier to entry. It's much cheaper for them to make, whereas videos and training courses do take a little bit more money that they may not have. Podcasts score really low, and I think that one's really fascinating. Now, as someone who has a podcast, I'm going to tell you my theory on why I think that is. Podcasts, again, low barrier to entry nowadays. You literally need a mic. I mean, you don't even need a mic. When I started my podcast, we started using just the laptop, and the audio is horrible. But, it's really easy to do it. And usually podcasts are, you've already thought about what you want to talk about. And so even if you haven't made a conscious decision about what your audience is, you've actually made it quite niche. So I think that's why podcasts, because it's got a very specific audience in mind, and security people like to talk security to other security people, it's definitely difficult in terms of the broader, wider world understanding what's going on there. And then last but not least, just because I thought it was interesting, I just had a look at the proportion of content that was paywalled. Now, if you're not familiar with the phrase paywalled, just in case, it means that you can only access it when you've paid. And I was actually pleasantly surprised that when I actually consciously went through and scored it, the majority was not paywalled. I will say that quite a lot of this stuff, particularly white papers and training courses, did require you to provide an email address so you could be bombarded with marketing, no doubt. But the fact that you didn't have to pay, I think, is a really good thing, because I know people can't afford it, especially you're not going to pay hundreds of dollars if you're just an everyday person trying to learn more about security, or if you're a sysadmin who does a bit of security on the side and maybe just works for a small, medium business. So I really like the fact that we do not have too much paywalling anymore. I think that's improved, again, over time. So I want to show you an example. Now, this is when I have to mess around on my machine. So let's see if we can do this without me completely messing up. So I've got here 3 documents that are largely pretty similar. So I've got from AWS, Google, and Microsoft, I have they're basically security architecture best practices. Now, we're not going to go into this in loads of detail because I'll run out of time. But you can see here, let's look at the AWS one to start with. We can see that this is our well-architected framework. Now, it is actually, this is the introduction. You can see it's nice and short. It is actually, but you can actually see if we look on the left here, it's actually very, 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 very long. If you PDF it here, it comes out at 125 pages. So as you can see, really just imagine, it's great if security is your job all day long, you might have time to read this over the course of a week. But imagine if you are a small, medium business, or someone who does this on the side, or you have one security person who does everything. Do you have time to read all of that? To do what you need to do? You need something concise. So that's the AWS version. If we have a look at Google's security cloud architecture, so roughly equivalent. It's got an overview. It looks a little bit shorter. It does, but I've just clicked on here. This was me looking like having another look at this last night. So it's talking here about how to manage your data sovereignty. I have just picked this at random, but you can see all it's doing is linking to more documents that you need to go and read. That are outside this main document. So although this looks a bit shorter, you've actually still got to go and click. There are no, it's basically saying here you have to do this sovereignty, or the best practices we recommend you do it, but then it's making you go and read a ton of other stuff. It's not telling you how to do it. So again, takes a lot of time. It's just giving you some theory here. It's not sort of concisely saying, hey, go do X, Y, Z. And then last but not least, for completeness, we will look at the Microsoft version of this. Now, the Microsoft version of this is called the Cloud Security Benchmark. And we can see slightly different format, but I won't do this now. I did it last night. These links here, there's 62 of them. So, and you can see it's linking to all these different things, but you've got to go and click on them. Some of them, and some of these documents are quite big. It sort of branches out into even more stuff. And again, takes a lot of time. There's nothing concise here going, hey, if you need to just get a baseline security thing, go do X, Y, Z, done. So that's just one example. It's just one example where we could compare like a couple of equivalent documents. So what do we do to actually fix this? Because I've basically talked about how we've got a problem, but what can we do to fix this? I want you to ask yourself these questions. Can anyone consume this content and go and do the thing that you want them to do when you actually wanted them to, when you created this content? Because generally in tech, we create content with a goal in mind, that we generally want people to go and do something. But I don't think we step back and say, hey, can anyone actually understand what I want them to do? Because we're not great at being concise. And who's going to use this and for what purpose? This sounds basic, and I think as a marketing communication principle, they ask themselves this a lot, but I think in tech we don't. You know, who's going to use this, or who needs to use this, and for what purpose? And does the content do that? And does someone need to take a significant portion out of their working day to consume this material? Because honestly, it blows my mind after I've done this research that we seem to think that people have a lot of spare time, like a lot, to spend and go through all this stuff. And I think most people don't. You know, even if your security is your full-time job, people have lives. and we seem to forget that people have lives. And does the material, if we remember back to school, you may remember at school, do we have a clear start, middle, end? Or do we just let it sprawl because it's a brain dump of our technical things and we're showing off to our friends about how we wrote or created a video? And then finally, the last two most important questions, could my mum understand this? So, don't know what your mum is like. My mum is amazing, and she can understand tech as long as it's explained to her in a straightforward way. She definitely gets it. But if I come in with jargon and acronyms and all the words, she has no idea what I'm talking about. And could a frontline worker understand this? So by frontline worker, I mean someone who uses tech as part of their day-to-day job, which is nearly everybody, by the way. So, you know, a cashier, a waitress, like anyone, a hospitality worker, anybody, they usually are using tech nowadays. And so could they understand what we're trying to get at? Because and we've had other talks that have talked about this yesterday. We love to blame the wider world for not doing security right, but we are not great at explaining what we want people to do or what they should do. So my other piece of advice is use TLDR. So for anyone who doesn't know this phrase, it did originate probably about 20 years ago in chat forums, but TLDR stands for too long, didn't read. Now the reason this phrase became a thing is because people were writing huge tomes of text, and the TLDR would be the thing that summarized it at the bottom. I love TLDR, and do you have a TLDR when you're making something? Something quick that someone can consume and go away and care about. And remember, there are three things you should do when you're creating content: what, why, and how. What you will often find when you read content is we're doing one of those things or two, but not the whole thing. And in this age of like very mass media that's quickly consumed and very short attention spans, particularly Gen Z, I'm not Gen Z, I'm like old millennial, but but I still have a fairly short attention span. And you need to make people care quickly. Like, what is it? Why should they care, and how do you do it? You need to be quick and grab their attention, otherwise people just switch off really, really quickly. So all of the above, please. But you might also be thinking, okay, Sarah, you've just stood up on that stage and been like, do all these things, please. I'm not going to say to you that refactoring content is easy. You probably have quite a lot of stuff that needs that's out there, and so target the most used, most visited, or your priority stuff, so that you can work through it. But it's definitely a journey. I'm not going to stand here and say this is something you can do really, really quickly. Now, I will practice what I preach, and this is my TLDR of this presentation. So security content, not written for the majority. We're not good at it. We like to write security content for other security people and then complain that the rest of the world doesn't follow our stuff. Go figure. Definitely not-for-profits are stronger at creating this more accessible content than other parts of industry in general. And we've got to change the way we create content. We've got to stop trying to impress everybody with just how much we know and actually make sure the rest of the world understands what we're talking about. I do think as well that there is a thing about it. I think we're getting better at it, but I do think the security industry suffers from a bit gatekeeping. We're a little bit gatekeepy, as in we'll be like, oh no, sorry, database person over there, you couldn't understand security, it's too hard, like I'm just very special. And we're not great at that. Like we like to sort of keep ourselves very exclusive. I think we're getting better, and that also it feeds into this content problem that we have, that we like to make security sound hard and very complicated because it makes us feel good. So remember, use that TLDR principle, and don't be afraid to give definitive guidance. Now again, I will cut myself off on this one because, again, I could talk about this for far too long and run out of time. But we are bad. We seem scared in industry more generally at saying, in order to secure yourself or give yourself a good baseline of security, go and do X, Y, Z. And I think the reason is that we all know that security is not 100%. We can't, we can never say, if you do X, Y, Z, there is no chance that you will be breached. We have to say, this will decrease your risk. And I think the problem that we have there is that the tech industry is run out of jurisdictions where they have a very litigious culture and a very litigation mindset. Litigious? That could probably be the wrong word, but they like litigation. And so there is this fear by giving this definitive guidance that we're going to get sued if something goes wrong. And I think there's a problem there in that most of the world looks to us security people, we're experts in whatever it is, to give that guidance. And if we turn around and say, hey, oh, well, it depends, you'll have to go and look at this, we're actually not helping people, because a lot of smaller businesses that make up the majority, of a cross-section of the whole economy, they don't have that time or that knowledge or those resources to do that. And I think we should almost shoot ourselves in the foot because of being scared. So I would challenge you to don't be afraid to give some definitive guidance, because we need to. Of course, we have to caveat that with, we're not saying you will never be breached if you do this, but this will lower your risk. And I also want to acknowledge that there are always going to be shades of gray in security, that you can't say X, Y, Z for absolutely everything, but we can give good baselines. We can do that. And fight me, we can do that. But yeah, please create security content for everyone. Please listen to Bernie. So your go-dos, your takeaways from this talk. Go review your organization's security content, whatever it is. Go see if it's concise. Go give it to your mom. Can it be reviewed by non-security? Can it be understood by non-security people? I have given one of my Microsoft books, by the way, to my mom. She said she had no idea, and she gave up after the first page. But that's cool because she doesn't need to do the things. Create TLDRs and clear steps for how to accomplish a task. It's great, all this theory, but make sure somewhere, or there's a quick jump to actually what you want people to go and do. Don't force them to read so much stuff. And probably, although maybe this should have come first, I wanted to finish on this point. Talk about this challenge with your content creators, whoever they are, because I think this is a problem that we are not even consciously thinking about a lot in the industry. We don't think about whether everyone can consume this. We just send it to our friend who's also in security, and we're like, does this look good? Yeah, it looks great. Okay, cool. And we're not even conscious of it. So I think the first challenge is we need to think about, is this actually useful to the wider world? So I think if you take away nothing from this, if you have an increased awareness that we have a challenge around that, then I'm a happy lady. Anyway, I have managed to finish on time. I have a couple of minutes if anyone wants to do questions, but thank you very much for joining me today. If anyone wants to ask questions now, head on up to the mic. I'll hang around though, so if you want to ask me anything privately or send me a message on social medias or my email, you can do. I also always come to talks with plenty of stickers and stuff like that, so feel free to come up at the end and take the things. Yeah, and thank you very much for your attention. Okay, we've got a question.
Yeah, hopefully this is not a curveball for you, Sarah. As a content creator, how do you deal with the trolling that happens? So, for example, I just did a blog post a couple of weeks ago, and the one criticism I got was because I didn't solve this one person's problem that they were having. So you're going to get those, you don't know what you're talking about, this is not the problem that I have. How do you suggest people deal with that?
Yeah, ooh, that's a little curveball, yes, but no, that's cool. Look, I think, you know what, I'm gonna throw something out here, which is probably actually comes from the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who I love. Oh, she's not Prime Minister anymore. Be kind. We like to troll. We know the internet is a horrible place, right? And we have a lot of keyboard warriors. I think I can't give any advice on specific advice on how you can stop people being horrible keyboard warriors, because you're right, not every blog post or content you write is going to answer every single person's question. I would say make sure there's a feedback channel, so maybe people can put comments and you can answer them there. But be nice to people. I think people get very brave behind a keyboard and in the anonymity of not face-to-face. And, we're all trying, everyone's trying to be, but also ignore the horrible people who are just trying to one-up. And if you're trying to one-up other people in industry, stop doing that. It's not cool, it's not constructive. But yeah, I think that's probably speaks to more of kind of toxic tech culture than the quality of the content. I think what I always do with feedback, because I've definitely had feedback on my content, constructive and non-constructive, is if someone gives you feedback that is constructive, so, have you considered addressing XYZ, or I don't think this bit was very clear, that's great. That's something you can work on. If people lean into you're rubbish, you're this. I've personally had, I can give you a personal example that I had on something I did. They said the girl, so nice and patronizing to start with, was arrogant, narcissistic. It was quite unpleasant. It's some of the most horrible feedback I've ever had on something. And that I just ignore. That's not constructive. That's just trolling. And I think you'd be safe to ignore that. Any other questions?
I hope this one is not too much of a curveball.
Try me.
No, but basically, I tend, because I try to create content as well, and I tend to notice that creating the why and the what is actually quite easy. But as soon as you go into the how, I feel like you have to involve the experts. So for instance, a database person, and involve them, how are you actually tackling the how, and can you help me create that content? But it seems like a paradox to me, because as soon as you involve that expert, it tends to go into detail and not be as concise. So you tend to go in the not TLDR phase.
Yeah.
So what would be your advice to actually tackle that?
Yeah, no, you're right. So you can't TLDR absolutely everything. I think for baseline, straightforward things where there's an accepted one way to do something, you absolutely can. When it gets a little bit more nuanced, what I found, something that one of my colleagues is a big fan of doing, is like a decision tree. Now, again, if it depends on the exact scenario, it can start to get really, really messy. But I do think you can still, what you don't want to give people an answer with is just, oh, it depends. It depends. Even if you can give people a couple of options that come from the experts, I'm not saying you can cover every single scenario with this, but I think we are not good at thinking how we can simplify as much as we possibly can. But you're right. I'm not saying we can do it for everything. So
the advice would basically be to try not to be perfect, but really try to cover the baselines and be content with that.
Yeah, and maybe if there are, say, we talk about edge cases and stuff. Oh, I've run out of time, but we talk about edge cases. Often with something, when there's a decision tree, you can sort of make, if it's X, Y, Z, do it this way. If it's X, Y, Z, do it this way. And we don't, whereas often I think we don't want to write that level of content. It sounds too complicated. So we just go, just go and read this and make your own mind up. So I do think there is still a simplification thing we can do to a point, but there will probably be some very edge things where you've just got to talk to someone, for sure.
Thanks.
Cool, I'm out of time. Also, I'm standing between you people and lunch, so I'll stop there. Thanks very much. I'll hang around though if you want to come chat. So thanks very much.